A massive earthquake just struck Japan, and the warning sign just reappeared. 1653 JST. Monday, April 20th, 2026. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake ruptures the seafloor, approximately 100 kilometers east-northeast of Miyako, Iwate Prefecture, along the Sanriku coast. The ground shakes for 7 full minutes in Tokyo, 450 kilometers to the south. Japan's meteorological agency issues a 3-meter tsunami warning for Iwate, Aomori, and Hokkaido within minutes. More than 180,000 people are told to evacuate immediately. Every seismologist in Japan knows this address. The Sanriku Coast, the Japan Trench, the same fault system that in March 2011 released a magnitude 9.0 earthquake and sent a wall of water 38 meters high into the Tohoku coast, killing 18,500 people. Here is the part almost no one in the mainstream coverage is saying out loud. This earthquake struck in a position on the fault that has appeared before in this exact sequence. And that position has a name, a mechanism, and a documented history that the headlines are not mentioning. If you've felt shaking today, or if you've been watching this story unfold, drop a comment with your location. And if you want the kind of analysis that goes past the headline, subscribe now, because this situation is not resolved. Let me be specific about the mechanics, because the mechanics are the whole point. The earthquake occurred at approximately 39.8 degrees north, 143.2 degrees east, at a depth the Japan Meteorological Agency placed at 10 kilometers below the seafloor. The USGS initially measured it at 7.4 magnitude at a depth of 35 kilometers, a discrepancy that reflects the difficulty of pinning a fast-moving rupture in real time. Japanese officials later revised their figure upward to 7.7. For the purposes of this analysis, we will use the JMA's revised magnitude of 7.7 and the 10-kilometer depth, because shallow ruptures at this fault position are what drive the tsunami generation physics. The fault system here is the convergent boundary between the Pacific Plate and the Okhotsk microplate running along the Japan Trench, a deep ocean scar that reaches nearly 9,000 meters below sea level in places. The Pacific Plate is moving westward, diving beneath the Okhotsk Plate at a rate of 7.9 to 9.2 centimeters per year. That is roughly the rate your fingernails grow. And year after year, decade after decade, that motion transfers stress into the locked portions of the plate interface. The plate interface here is not a flat ramp. It has geometry. Approximately 80 kilometers landward of the trench axis, the dip angle of the plate boundary increases sharply, from roughly 5 degrees to roughly 15 degrees. That change in dip creates two mechanically distinct zones, a shallow, gently inclined up-dip region near the trench, and a steeper, deeper down-dip seismogenic zone further inland. These two zones behave differently. They store stress differently, and they release it differently. Monday's earthquake struck in the zone between the two. The epicenter places it within the domain that seismologists describe as the up-dip limit of the seismogenic zone, the boundary where the fault transitions from locked and brittle to ductile and creeping. The Sanriku coast is one of the most seismically cataloged stretches of ocean floor on Earth. This specific arc of the Japan Trench has produced 4 earthquakes above magnitude 7.5 in the past century alone. The 1933 Sanriku event at 8.4, which killed 3,068 people in the resulting tsunami. The 1968 Tokachi Oki at 7.9, the 1994 Sanriku Haruka Oki at 7.7, and the 2011 Tohoku at 9.0. That is 4 major to great earthquakes in roughly 90 years, roughly one every 22 years. The last one was 15 years ago. And in December 2025, a magnitude 7.6 struck approximately 140 kilometers north-northwest of Monday's epicenter. 2 large ruptures on the same system in 5 months is the first number you should be holding. The Japanese response on April 20th was a demonstration of institutional memory functioning exactly as designed. At 1653 JST, the moment of the rupture, the Japan Meteorological Agency had already begun automated seismic processing. By 1700, the agency had issued a 3-meter tsunami warning for the Iwate coast, a 1-meter advisory for adjacent Aomori and Hokkaido prefectures, and evacuation orders were being broadcast to more than 182 municipalities across 7 prefectures.
That is 7 minutes from rupture to mass evacuation notice.
By 1930, the JMA activated what it calls the Off the Coast of Hokkaido and Sanriku Subsequent Earthquake Advisory, a specific institutional mechanism that has only existed since 2022. The advisory system was built in direct response to a recognized pattern in the Sanriku region, the occurrence of strong M7 level earthquakes followed by larger events in the same zone. The The system's trigger conditions require a magnitude 7 rupture in the Hokkaido Iwate offshore zone before the advisory can be issued. Monday's earthquake met that threshold. The advisory is valid until April 27th. It is not a prediction. It is an institutional acknowledgement that the probability window has shifted. The JMA stated publicly that the likelihood of a magnitude 8 or greater event in the next week has risen to approximately 1%, compared to a baseline of 0.1% in ordinary times, a tenfold increase in probability. That language is careful and calibrated and easy to dismiss. Do not dismiss it. What you are watching is a system that learned from 2011, formalized that learning into a protocol, and then activated that protocol within hours of a qualifying event. The same coast, the same fault system. The system is working. The question the system cannot answer is what it is working toward. The United Nations nuclear watchdog confirmed by 8:16 UTC, 23 minutes after the rupture, that no abnormalities had occurred at any Japanese nuclear facility. That communication speed is itself a product of 2011. Here is the part that mainstream coverage is moving past too quickly. Monday's earthquake struck at what seismologists call the up-dip zone of the Japan Trench Megathrust. Let me explain why that specific position matters more than the magnitude number does. A subduction zone megathrust is not a single fault. It is a layered system. The deepest locked section, the seismogenic zone, is where the classic large interplate earthquakes nucleate.
That is the zone that ruptures in a conventional M7 or M8 event. It is deep, it is well studied, and its behavior is relatively well understood within the community. But above it, between the locked seismogenic zone and the ocean floor, is the up-dip region, the shallow, near-trench section of the plate interface. This part of the fault is mechanically different. It is more compliant, more capable of accommodating stress through slow slip rather than fast, brittle fracture. And when it does rupture fast, it has a specific and dangerous behavior. It produces large seafloor displacement with less high-frequency shaking. It generates tsunamis that are disproportionate to the shaking intensity. A paper by Lei and colleagues published in Science in 2012, following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, identified what they called a tsunami earthquake mechanism at the up-dip zone. Events where shallow, near-trench rupture generates tsunamis far larger than the seismic moment alone would predict. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake involved catastrophic rupture through the up-dip zone all the way to the trench axis, producing seafloor displacements of up to 50 meters. That is what generated waves capable of running 10 kilometers inland. Monday's event did not do that. The tsunami observations, 80 centimeters at Kuji Port, 40 centimeters at Miyako, are well below the warning levels issued. The system overperformed in the sense that the tsunami was smaller than modeled. That is good news. But here is what the good news does not tell you. A paper by Kato and colleagues published in Science in 2012 documented the slow slip migration that preceded the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. Beginning in January 2011, low-frequency tremor and slow slip events were migrating up-dip toward the trench along the plate interface. The migration reached the vicinity of a 2011 hypocenter in early March. The M7.3 foreshock on March 9th struck. The M9.0 main shock followed on March 11th. The sequence had a geometry. Slow slip migrated to the hypocenter. A large foreshock activated the up-dip zone adjacent to the locked seismogenic asperity. The main shock ruptured both. Now let me place Monday's earthquake in that geometry. Research published in Earth, Planets, and Space by Nakamura and colleagues documented that the foreshock seismicity before the 2011 Tohoku earthquake was initially activated at the up-dip limit of the seismogenic zone, approximately 30 kilometers trenchward of where the largest M7.3 foreshock nucleated. That is, activity started shallow near the trench, then moved to the classic seismogenic depth. Monday's epicenter at 39.8 degrees north, 143.2 degrees east, at 10 kilometers depth, places it at the boundary between those two structural regimes, near the up-dip limit of the seismogenic zone for this section of the Japan Trench. The Japan Meteorological Agency has not used the word foreshock in its public communications about Monday's event. That silence is deliberate. The JMA has also not ruled out that characterization. Both of those statements are simultaneously true. What they have said is, be ready. The subsequent earthquake advisory exists precisely because the seismological record of this coast includes multiple instances of a large M7 level event being followed by a larger one. The question is whether Monday is a standalone stress release event
or whether it is telling us something about where the locked portion of the fault is heading. The most important number in this entire story is 51. On March 9, 2011, at 11:45 JST, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck the Miyagi-Oki region off the Sanriku coast. It was a strong event. It triggered no major advisory. It generated a small tsunami. It was noted, filed, and within a day, the headlines had moved on. 51 hours later, at 14:46 JST on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake ruptured the same fault system. It remains the fourth most powerful earthquake in recorded human history. The tsunami it generated reached 38.9 meters in run-up height at Miyako, roughly the height of a 12-story building. Nearly 20,000 people died. The March 9th event was later classified by Japanese seismologists as the largest foreshock in the Tohoku sequence. In the subsequent literature, it is described as having accelerated slow-slip migration along the updip zone, essentially unlocking a portion of the shallow fault interface and loading additional stress onto the main seismogenic asperity to the south. But here's the part that still unsettles the seismological community. In real time, on March 9, 2011, no agency called that event a foreshock. No Mega-quake advisory was issued. The Japanese seismic monitoring community had the event in their data. They had the aftershock sequence. They had the slip models.
And not one public communication used language that would have changed the evacuation posture of 18,500 people who died 2 days later. A retrospective study by Hirose and colleagues published in the journal Earth, Planets, and Space in 2011 documented the foreshock sequence extending back to January of that year, a 2-month buildup of low-frequency events migrating toward the eventual rupture zone. The signal was in the data. The interpretation framework to read it as a warning did not yet exist in operational form. That framework now partially exists. The JMA's subsequent earthquake advisory system, the exact system activated on April 20th, 2026, is the institutional consequence of the March 9th, 2011 failure to escalate. It was built specifically because the 51-hour gap happened. And in December 2025, a magnitude 7.6 struck 140 kilometers north-northwest of Monday's epicenter. The advisory was activated then, too. A larger earthquake did not follow in the subsequent week. The advisory expired. The coast relaxed. 4 months later, Monday's earthquake struck further south along the same system. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that Monday's event is a foreshock to a future M9. I am claiming that the structural and historical record of this specific fault segment includes an instance where a magnitude 7.3 event preceded a magnitude 9.0 event by 51 hours, and that the mechanism proposed for that sequence, updip slow-slip activation, migration to a locked asperity, foreshock nucleation at the updip limit, has features that are geometrically consistent with Monday's event. That is not a prediction. It is the statistical and geological context you should be holding while the April 27th advisory window remains open. Let me give you the 3 honest interpretations of what happened on Monday, because anyone who gives you only one is not doing this correctly. Branch 1, standalone stress release. Monday's M7.7 is exactly what it looks like at face value, a large interplate earthquake releasing accumulated strain at the updip boundary of the Sanriku segment of the Japan Trench. The Pacific Plate has been moving toward the Okhotsk Plate at 8 to 9 centimeters per year. The fault locked, stress built, the system released it. This is the fundamental cycle of subduction zone seismicity. In this branch, the December 2025 M7.6 and the April 2026 M7.7 are sequential independent stress releases from adjacent segments of a system under chronic loading. The subsequent earthquake advisory expires on April 27th. No M8+ event occurs, and the Sanriku coast enters a period of relatively reduced seismic hazard as the accumulated strain is partially discharged. The honest probability range for this branch, given the base rate of the Sanriku system and the behavior of analogous subduction zones following M7+ events, sits in the 75 to 85% window. This is the most likely outcome. The system releasing and settling is what subduction zones do most of the time. Branch 2, foreshock to a larger event. In this branch, Monday's earthquake has accelerated slow slip migration along the updip zone in the manner documented before the 2011 Tohoku sequence. The stress transferred by Monday's rupture has loaded the adjacent locked asperity further south, possibly the Miyagi-Oki segment,
which produced the classic M7.5 repeating earthquakes every 40 years, and which has not produced a characteristic event since being overprinted by the 2011 M9.0 rupture. In this branch, we are within the 51-hour to several-week window of elevated cascading risk. The signals to watch for: a cluster of M4 to M5 aftershocks migrating southward along the trench, and low-frequency tremor detections in the SNet seafloor monitoring array.
The honest probability range for a M8+ event in the next 7 days, given Monday's event, is the JMA's own stated figure, approximately 1%, against a background of 0.1%. That is not alarming, but it is 10 times background. For a coastline with 1.5 million people within the tsunami inundation zone modeled for a M8.5 plus Sanriku event, a 1% probability has a different moral weight than a 1% probability of rain. Branch 3, the extended stress cycle. This is the branch that has no clean resolution. In this interpretation, the Sanriku system is in a multi-year, multi-event stress redistribution phase that began with the 2011 M9.0 rupture and has not finished. The 2011 earthquake transferred enormous stress to adjacent fault segments, the Sanriku Oki to the north, the Miyagi Oki to the south, and the interface further updip that did not fully rupture in 2011. The December 2025 M7.6, the March 2026 M6.5 in the same general region, and Monday's M7.7 may be sequential steps in a fault system that is still searching for equilibrium after the largest earthquake it has produced in 1,200 years. In this branch, the risk is not a single large event in the next week. The risk is a multi-year period of elevated probability for M7.5 plus events on this segment, any one of which could trigger the residual tsunami hazard that 2011 didn't fully clear. The signals that would distinguish Branch 2 from Branch 3 are the same: southward migration of aftershock sequences and seafloor geodesy from the SNet and GeoNet arrays indicating whether slow slip is propagating toward the locked Miyagi-Oki asperity. This will not resolve on April 27th. It will resolve piecemeal over months. Every time a major earthquake strikes Japan, 4 specific alternative claims begin circulating within hours. I want to address all 4 directly and with the actual physics. Claim 1. HARP, or directed energy weapons, triggered the earthquake. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska operates at a maximum radiated power of 3.6 megawatts. The energy released by Monday's M7.7 earthquake was approximately 2 times 10 to the 22nd power joules. That is, on the order of 5 times 10 to the 15th power watt-hours, or roughly 14 billion kilowatt-hours. HARP's maximum continuous output, running for the entire age of the universe, could not accumulate that energy. This is not a matter of interpretation. The orders of magnitude simply do not connect. Claim 2. Unusual animal behavior. Oarfish beachings, strange fish patterns, predicted or triggered the event. Oarfish are deep-sea fish that occasionally beach themselves, and clusters of beachings near Japan have preceded some historical earthquakes. This is a real observation that deserves a real answer rather than ridicule. A study by Ikea and colleagues explored the possibility of electromagnetic anomalies in the pre-seismic environment affecting deep-water organisms. The research is legitimate as a hypothesis, but has not produced a reliable predictive mechanism. The oarfish sightings that preceded the 2011 Tohoku earthquake were documented after the fact. They were not used in real-time forecasting and could not have been. Correlation in a system this complex does not establish mechanism. The claim is not falsified, but it is not actionable. Claim 3. The Japanese government is concealing damage to nuclear facilities. As of 8:16 UTC on April 20th, 23 minutes after the rupture, the IAEA confirmed no abnormalities at Japanese nuclear facilities. This was followed by independent monitoring from the Japanese Nuclear Regulation Authority. Nuclear facilities in Japan have been designed since 2012 to the standards derived from the 2011 Fukushima disaster, including protection against tsunamis of up to 20 meters. Monday's observed tsunami at Kyuji Port reached 80 centimeters. The concealment claim is not supported by the monitoring record. Claim 4. The Nankai Trough is next. This is actually the most legitimate concern, and it is not a conspiracy claim. The Nankai Trough, running south of Japan where the Philippine sea plate subduces beneath Honshu, is independently overdue for a magnitude 8 to 9 event. The Japan government has acknowledged this explicitly. Monday's earthquake did not occur on the Nankai system, and there is no established physical mechanism by which a Sanriku rupture directly triggers a Nankai event.
But the underlying concern that Japan has multiple high-risk subduction zones under concurrent stress loading is supported by the science and is worth taking seriously on its own terms.
Let me explain why this matters to people who do not live within 500 kilometers of the Sanriku coast. Japan's northeastern coast, the Tohoku and Hokkaido Pacific shorelines, is the site of critical global infrastructure that is directly exposed to megathrust rupture and tsunami risk. 5 nuclear facilities sit within or adjacent to the evacuation planning zones for a repeat of a 2011 scale event: Onagawa Nuclear Power Plant in Miyagi Prefecture, Higashidori in Aomori, Tomari in Hokkaido, and the decommissioning sites at Fukushima Daiichi and Daini, which still contain significant quantities of spent nuclear fuel in storage. Onagawa, which survived 2011 after its seawall held, is now the site of a planned reactor restart under Japan's post-2022 energy security policy. A M8.5 plus Sanriku event, with a different epicenter geometry than 2011, could produce run-up profiles at Onagawa that exceed its current seawall design parameters. The GPS positioning infrastructure in this region matters globally. Japan's GeoNet network, 1,300 continuous GPS observation stations, is one of the primary reference frames for satellite-based precision positioning in the Asia-Pacific region. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake moved parts of the Japanese coast by up to 5.3 meters eastward, requiring a fundamental recalibration of the geodetic reference frame that Japan's precision agriculture, infrastructure monitoring, and autonomous navigation systems depend on. A second large displacement event, even at M8 rather than M9, would trigger another recalibration cycle with direct consequences for aviation, maritime navigation, and the growing fleet of autonomous vehicles in the region. The global shipping dimension is rarely discussed. The port of Sendai, the port of Hachinohe, and the fishing infrastructure of the Sanriku coast contribute significantly to Japan's food security and to Pacific trade routes. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami destroyed approximately 319 fishing ports in Tohoku. Japan's fisheries recovery took over a decade. A second major event before full infrastructure hardening is complete would compound that damage. And there is the precedent of what a second major earthquake does to insurance and reinsurance markets. Lloyd's of London and the global reinsurance sector experienced catastrophic model failure after 2011. The earthquake-tsunami sequence exceeded the return period assumptions in every major catastrophe model then in use. The models have since been recalibrated, but the gap between modeling precision and actual event behavior in a complex system like the Japan Trench has not closed. The 1% advisory window the JMA has opened is what the models say is possible. The 2011 event itself was, on prior model assumptions, a roughly 0.1% annual probability. That probability was wrong. What has changed since 2011 is the monitoring. The SNet seafloor seismic network, 150 stations on the ocean floor along the Japan Trench, now gives Japan near real-time data on seafloor motion that did not exist before 2016. The monitoring has improved. The exposure has not decreased. Both of those facts are simultaneously true. Here's the essential question that the April 27th advisory deadline does not answer. The Japan Trench has now produced 2 M7.5 plus earthquakes in 5 months on adjacent sections of the same fault system. The SNet seafloor network is recording the aftershock sequence in real time. GeoNet's GPS array is measuring whether the surface of Japan is moving in ways consistent with ongoing slow slip. The seismologists at the JMA and at the Earthquake Research Institute in Tokyo are watching the same data you and I cannot see. What they are watching for, specifically, is whether the aftershock pattern from Monday's event shows any indication of southward migration toward the Miyagi-Oki segment. That segment produced the repeating M7.5 events that characterize the classic seismogenic cycle of this coast. It was overprinted, not cleared, by the 2011 rupture. Its stress budget in the post-2011 period is one of the open problems in Japanese seismology. The monitoring system that exists today was built specifically because in 2011, the monitoring was insufficient to read the signal in time. That monitoring now exists. The question it is trying to answer is whether the signal it is currently receiving is the end of a cycle or the middle of one. 51 hours is not a law. It is one data point. But the Japan Trench does not negotiate with anniversaries or advisory windows. It operates on its own clock, storing 8 centimeters of convergence every year, releasing it on its own schedule. The coast is watching. The instruments are listening. For the first time in the history of this fault, we might actually hear what they hear.